Good morning. Pretty lights, pretty lights. Alright, let's get down to business. So, now we're going to talk, or I am going to talk about code transpiling. So, let's start by defining or rather, giving you my definition of code transpilation. So, what is code transpilation? Well, in essence, transpiling is to convert one set of code into another set of code. Now you can do that from, say, a language to another language. Like there's a bunch of languages that are built on top of JavaScript, for example, where probably most of this little rant of mine is going to stick or stay. That's the context. But that's one way, and another way is to convert, well, you can have code that converts like JavaScript once again. So take Babel, for example. Babel is it's a de facto standard for the front-end industry today, and it's needed in order to, for the most part, to do a lot of the more modern syntaxes and transpiling it down, like ES15 or ES6, whatever you prefer, to transpile that down into ES5 in order for it to be compatible in older browsers. So in essence, all it does is it takes a few statements that only works in ES6 and converts it to ES5 syntax. So your first and foremost question may or may not be, okay, why would I use a transpiler? Well, you would use a transpiler first and foremost in, let's say, take Babel. The most common reason to use it is so that you can access features of a language that are not supported in all the browsers. That's the first case most people use it, and the popularity of Babel is very much due. It's very tied into this need to be able to do all of these things. And it's also very important to mention that React, for example, who uses the JSX or JSX file format or like language, it's not even a language, but JSX, using that way of writing JavaScript code, depends on, or rather I would say that a lot of its success, because the syntax is very natural to a lot of developers. It's very HTML-like, and the adoption, I honestly believe that a big part of the adoption popularity for React is due to this syntax, because it's so close to HTML that most people just kind of get it immediately. Well, immediately is a strong word, but anywho. So you use Babel to then convert this HTML-like syntax into what's actually just plain old JavaScript, and you can actually go, if you ever run it through Babel, you can actually go and see what it's going to output, which is this hogwash, but it's going to be a much more complicated syntax, because at the end of the day, all you're really doing is that you're converting something that looks one way into something that is like real valid code, just plain old JavaScript. So there are a few other examples of this. Elm, for example, is a transpilation language. It's a language that compiles down or transpiles down to JavaScript. Same thing goes for ClojureScript, for example. And yeah, that's pretty much it, really. So what are my thoughts on this? Well, my thoughts on transpilation is I'm actually torn between the two. I think there is a really, really good use case for it, and I also think that it's absolutely horrible the way that we are approaching things. So I've been working with React for a few years now, and I can tell you firsthand that the absolute worst part about being a front-end developer today is that there is literally hundreds of things that you need to learn, and transpilation is one of those things that I feel it's pushing us in a direction that I really don't like. I have colleagues on my project who will add like stage 0 support for certain things, and for those of you who don't know what that is, it's basically features to JavaScript that aren't actually finalized yet. They're experimental features, and because they use transpilers, they can add that in and then transpile it down to actual code. And honestly, the way that I think about transpilation is that if you take Elm or for like one of the other transpiled languages, I really don't like this idea where you're basically trying to abstract away the actual underlying technology from me too much, and in essence creating an entire language on top of another language. There are certain situations when this is useful, but I don't think that there's much value in doing it for the language itself. There are tools that are very, very handy for, well, like certain use cases. I think it makes a lot of sense. Like Electron and React Native have very strong use cases if you know how you're going to use them. Like Electron, I argue, is probably the strongest use case for transpilers, where you, or rather, that's more, well, it is a transpiler in essence, where you can write JavaScript code and use the web technologies to create native native desktop applications. And then you have React Native, which does pretty much the same thing. The thing is that these are very specific use cases, and the reason why I, for example, am not sold on Elm is that it's something which you're basically just you're creating a language on top of JavaScript, and my fear is that when you do that, you will you're not providing, you're not solving a problem for me. You're giving me another way to solve a problem, which is fine. I mean, there's a value in this, but I argue that in my opinion, that like, you remember that Elm isn't doing anything you can't do in JavaScript. And to me, there is more value in learning the actual language that is used to provide all of this value that I'm trying to create through code, and using that instead of learning the language on top of it, if you will. Because the further, in my opinion, the further away you get from the underlying technologies, the less, like the more likely you are to find issues, limitations, that sort of thing. So if you're opting into Elm today in a production environment, then I'm saying that my argument is that you probably have to know what you're doing, because trust me, the ecosystem for Elm and the support for different tools and all that, there are all these limitations which you don't have in JavaScript, and you trade that for the benefit of, you trade the benefits of just having JavaScript as the language you're using for the perceived value you get from Elm. And that's exactly what transpilers do as well. You can use a transpiler, add all that extra complexity on top of your code base, and all of a sudden you have this entire, you have a workflow that gets more and more complicated just because you want to have some extra features or whatever. And for the most part, I can only speak for myself, it's very rare that I find a really good excuse, like a really good reason for us to use these transpilers. It's not much, it doesn't really save us much in time, it doesn't really do all that much, with the exceptions, as I said, if you want to use Electron or something like that, or React Native, then you need to do that, or JSX. These are exceptions to the rule, but I don't want us to become like, I personally feel that it's nicer to either wait until these features are added in or whatever, because my personal desire is to keep things as simple as possible. And I think that the more stuff we add on top with transpilers and like Webpack and so forth, like the front end is getting very complicated very, very quickly. That's my personal opinion. It's gotten to the point where what used to be this very easy structure, you had HTML, you had CSS, and you had script tags for JavaScript, is today in fact so complicated. I mean, I'm not one to complain. I mean, my entire job is based around this. That's kind of insane, right? It's getting so complicated that you're actually getting full-time people to be able to do this. So and on the plus side for transpilation, which I think is really, really valuable, as I said, Electron is a really good example of good transpilation, I think. React Native is also a very good example of good transpilation. If you're doing it right, you shouldn't be using React Native if you're just making a single Android application or a single iOS application or something, or if you're in a learning experience. Don't just throw it in there. Think about what you're doing, because remember, you're adding more complexity. And another really good use case, which is my favorite for transpilation, I'm very excited about this, is code refactor, like real massive code refactoring, which you can use things such as a abstract syntax tree to kind of do massive rewrites. Like if you have a big code base and you wanted to update it from ES5 to ES6, for example, then there are tools which you can actually point at your code and it will rewrite all your code into the more modern language. And I think that's a great thing. I mean, it's a really strong use case for transpilers, where you can literally refactor a code base that would be taking months, maybe years to refactor in an automated fashion. And I think there's a lot of power there. And honestly, I hope this idea will be expanded, because that's going to save a lot of people a lot of time. So these are my thoughts on transpilers. Another strong, and I think I would love it if it doesn't go that route, but there are languages like Clojure and Scala and Go and a few others which are typed languages that transpile into JavaScript in order to get types in there. And if you are really struggling with, I mean, Google used to do this. Google didn't know, like a long time ago, way back when, before they became like the most powerful corporation in the world, Google would actually transpile a lot of their Java code into JavaScript. And so that's another good use case for transpilation. If you don't have an expert on JavaScript at your company, it might be good for you to look into having like someone who knows maybe one of these type languages, looking into a transpiler that will convert, that code into JavaScript. But once again, transpilers do have their downs. Like it's not all good. It adds a lot of complexity, and it also adds a bigger surface of failure, and more dependencies and all of that stuff. So be careful when you use them, and you follow my rules for when to use them. If you are creating, like if you're doing a massive code rewrite, use them. If you are stressed and you need to create an application for both iOS and for Android, use React Native, which is a transpiler, great. And like if you want to make a desktop application and you don't have the time to, like if you lack the knowledge, that's probably the essence here. If you don't have the knowledge and you don't have time to learn the new stuff in order to do it for a specific platform, then use a transpiler. But don't add them in just because, don't make it an arbitrary decision, because it will affect your project long term.